Chapter 4. We'll See. Lieutenant Brian Hugh looked back. The way he had come was clear. He slapped his thigh, pleased. When he separated from Major Danforth and Sergeant Tremaine at the creek, he rode directly north for a fast quarter-mile. He found a road there that ran east and west. He cantered 100 yards west on it, then cut north, again off-road, making a broad half-circle, arcing east through the woods, back to where he first found the road. He paused there and listened. He heard the dead men churning toward him. He rode another 100 yards east, then cut across the road and galloped directly south. He rode parallel to the northbound path he had made for a mile, hoping to God that the things chasing him were not organized enough to send scouts out on their flanks. He slowed his mount in a stand of snow-covered pines and halted, listening. The steady crash of men running through the trees, chattering back and forth in what sounded like 1,000 different tongues, was terrifying. It took long moments for the dead army to move beyond his hiding place. Brian Hugh imagined them reaching the road and ploughing along the trail he had laid to the west, following it back through the woodland, then turning south to where he stood now. He kicked his mount in the ribs and guided him west through the woods, straight to the broad swath the dead men had left behind them. He turned south and galloped through the torn snow, praying his passage was as imperceptible as it seemed. When he reached the creek bed where he originally split from Major Danforth, he rode at a steady clip along the path on which they'd come until he reached the Siegfried line. From there he cut south, following the edge of the barbed wire. After an hour of steady riding, he found the San Quentin Canal, whose cut would lead him down to San Quentin proper and the barge as promise of hope. Brian slowed his horse to a walk. He saw burnt bodies put to the torch by Philip Halstead, riding the canal's gentle current south. He looked through the fast-falling snow for pursuers. Nothing but swirling ice crystals and darkness. It seemed he had successfully put them off his trail, yet he did not feel too comforted. He drew his saber, resting it on his shoulder. He had seen these things move fast and silent. If they came for him while he was edged against the canal, he would not have time to draw and respond. In the distance he heard a canine howl. "Stay sharp, lad. Stay sharp," he said to himself. He rode on, slow and steady, towards San Quentin. The little boy, wearing Philip Halstead's blistered skin, paused in the snow. He heard his wolf sounding off, and he fought the urge to howl back at her. He wanted her by his side for this hunt, though he knew it was foolish. He really just ought to let her enjoy herself. Eventually she would catch his scent and find him, or he would find her, and then they could go forward together. Patience. For now he would track the horseman's hoofprints until he ran him down. He checked the trail. The horse had slowed to a walk, and falling snow had not yet softened the outline of the horseshoes. The cavalryman would not be far. Little boy Halstead loosened his spear arm and lengthened his strides. He covered several 100 yards at a steady clip. As he rounded a long bend in the canal, he caught sight of the rider ahead of him in the distance, trotting along the towpath toward the city. When the horseman looked back to see if he was followed, Halstead ducked low. He circled up into the woods overlooking the canal bank and began to close the ground between him and his prey. Now the real game began. Shen Su tripped and fell. The metal pole struck the base of his skull, where the top vertebrae connected, stunning him, sending a jolt of pain shivering through his back. The gas cans crashed into the snow. Sue pushed himself up, righting the cans quickly to save their precious cargo. Only then did he pause to recover from the pain. He knelt and carefully shifted his stiffening neck. It still had most of its range of motion. He worried that might not remain the case. There was a crackling noise coming from it as it turned. Although it was not brutally painful, the sensation suggested something beyond a minor bruising. He bent down and slid the ramrod back through the gas can handles, then knelt and eased the pole behind his neck, balancing the cans as he set his front foot and pressed back up to standing. He lost balance for a second, but caught himself before he tumbled again. Sue leaned in the direction he needed to go, forging ahead on legs that felt brittle, praying for the strength to reach his destination. He had never felt this weak in his entire life. When the cargo ship, carrying its load of Chinese men, finally reached France from Canada, Shen Su was far from the strong young blacksmith he had been when he boarded the first ship. Midway across the Atlantic, they hit the first storms. The rest of the journey found them in a near constant gale. From the bowels of the ship, it seemed the massive waves were trying to turn and flip them at least once every half hour. Whenever the ship yawed past 45 degrees, whimpers of terror ran through the hold, and though Sue kept his whimpering silent, inside, his mind was crying out too. When they stepped haltingly on unsteady legs down the long wooden gangplank onto the solidity of the French docks, he was unsure he would be able to find the willpower to climb back up into the ship that would be meant to take him home, assuming he somehow survived his 3 years of indenture. Between poor nutrition and seasickness, he had dropped at least 20 pounds. Most of what had vanished, he was certain, had been muscle. Shen Su did not think he would ever regain the strength lost on the long journey. After the last Chinese man disembarked from the ship, they milled on the wooden jetty and watched the bustle of men and materiel pouring out of the quay. Thousands of crates pulled off cargo ships sent by America and England were piled high. Cranes hefted artillery pieces from ship decks and swung them over onto the dock, narrowly missing swarms of men in olive drab and horizon blue who were running about beneath them, trying to organize the chaotic flow of incoming ordnance without getting killed by it. A gangplank dropped off another ship, and row upon row of sullen British infantrymen tramped down, returning to a war they had hoped and prayed would somehow be over and done before their leave in England ended. The French concrete beneath their feet was proof the prayers had gone entirely unanswered. Sue watched Labour battalions slaving away. It was a bizarre sight, a shock to Sue's system. This world he had known bits and pieces of, but never imagined would be realized. He had, of course, heard of black men and women, not figuring he would ever see one in the flesh. Here, the docks were teeming with them. Scar-faced Senegals in French horizon blue, turbaned Indians in khaki, not black-skinned, but the hue of their flesh was still far from Sue and his compatriots' own fair complexions. Beside them worked stout, brown-skinned New Zealand Maoris, their faces tattooed even darker with brutal Tomoko ink. A flurry of Canadian non-commissioned officers began counting off platoons of 50 men, separating the Chinese into companies of 200, and lining them up with warrant officers. Shen Su found himself in a group facing Andy Millington, a dumpy Canadian fellow with bright blonde hair and a warrant officer's crown on his shoulder. He smiled at the muddle of Chinese men who had survived a journey across 2 oceans and a continent, then staggered down out of their floating tomb to be reborn on the docks under his command. The big Chinese fellow stood beside Andy. Li Peng wore the blue tunic and pants of the Chinese Labour Corps, but his uniform had a sergeant's chevrons sewn on the sleeves. Andy gave Peng a nod, and he began in Mandarin. "I am your sergeant. You will call me Sergeant Li. You will do as I command. Understood?" Peng asked. Su and the others in his company listened and nodded. Li Peng's Chinese was not too badly broken, despite the Canadian accent. Sergeant Li nodded toward Andy. "This is Warrant Officer Millington. He don't like Chinese folks, even though he smiles a lot. But we don't care if a Canadian likes us or hates us, so long as he pays us. Yes?" There was a murmur of laughter amongst the CLC men. Although this second-generation Chinese was a shade less than perfect, it seemed that Sergeant Li was a truth-teller. Li Peng continued. "Now, Warrant Officer Millington is head man here. I know he looks like a soft-bellied fool, and he sure is that, eh? But the crown on his sleeve defines him, not the truth of him. He can't speak Chinese, and I sure don't intend to try to teach it to him, eh? Mine is bad enough, and better that we can say what we need to say amongst ourselves without a bother. Yes?" There was a general nodding of agreement in Peng's audience. Peng continued. "He's got some things to speak, and I'm going to translate them, but don't get confused here. He's in charge. We're here to work at whatever he tells us. We're going to break our backs. We're going to break our legs. Some of you are going to break your necks. Never see Shandong and your mamas and papas again. You're going to see some things you've never seen. They're going to stay in your brain until the day you die. Ugly things. But I promise you, long as you do your work, don't cause me headaches. I'm the man who's going to hand you your pay and make the marks that guarantee your mamas and papas get their money too, when all's said and done. You all understand?" There was some quiet nodding in response. "Don't just stand there nodding. When I ask you a question, from this moment on, I want you to say 2 words, loud and clear, and only 2 words. I ask a question, you say, 'Yes, Sergeant.' Understood?" There was more nodding, and a few quiet attempts at, "Yes, Sergeant." Peng bit his lip, then sighed. No. He mocked them, meek and humble, quiet and unassuming. "Not, 'Yes, Sergeant.' Like this." He puffed out his chest. "I say, 'Do you understand?' You say, 'Yes, Sergeant Li.' Otherwise, Warrant Officer Millington is not going to believe that you heard what you was told to do, eh?" It was quiet laughter. "I'm going to try again, okay?" Peng put his hands on his hips. "Do you understand?" This time, the response shook the docks as Su and all his compatriots replied, buoyed by the fact that an ally now stood between them and their fate. "Yes, Sergeant Li!" Sergeant Li smiled. He turned to Warrant Officer Millington with a slight bow. "Sir." Andy stepped forward. He gave a long discourse about duty and serving the king and how he would not take any nonsense off his men. Li Peng dutifully translated. Afterwards, they were marched from the docks to a fatigue camp, where they were given another thorough, poisonous delousing and fresh blue uniforms, along with puttees and ill-fitting boots, which wore their feet to hot, blistered mush, as they were marched without cadence into France. After a 2-hour hike, they boarded a line of idling trucks and rode them over potholes and mud toward the front, passing long lines of beleaguered French and British wounded, being lorried and marched the opposite direction. When the truck Shen Su was riding in pulled to a halt, Su got a good look at the soldiers humping east when a file of broken men, eyes open and seeing things that had nothing to do with the roadway before them, stumbled past. Su shook his head. His scrawny neighbor, Zi Chang, saw it. "What are you shaking your head at, Shen Su?" Su watched the seemingly never-ending line of half-dead men draw away from them as the trucks lurched forward and bounced on down the road. "They may not be dead, but something's been killed in those fellows, that's for sure," Su said. Chang nodded. "That's how war does a man. My father looked like that after Ye Tuan. Both his brothers shot dead in front of him in Beijing by the fucking Americans. I remember when he headed off to fight, he believed he could not be killed. I believed it too. I'd seen the fighter he was, strong, fast hands, gleam in his eye when he boxed. But that gleam disappeared in Beijing. He came home without a gleam, with no more brothers. His eyes looking just like those fellows. He sits around now, drinking rice wine, waiting for his guts to fail so he can go and box with his brothers again in the afterlife, nay?" Su nodded. Everyone knew someone who had taken part in the Boxer uprising and paid the price. Every time the tax collectors visited the village, they paid the price again, as a vast portion of the proceeds the collectors subjected them to were bound to flow across the ocean as reparations to the Americans, British, Germans, Austrians, Japanese, French, Russians, and Italians who linked arms to bring the proud Chinese boxers back down to their knees. It was past midnight when they settled into camp, in a vast lavender field bordering the British Army's general headquarters. Su sat outside the canvas tent, inhaling the lush scent of lavender blooms and staring up at the vastness of space. The waxing moon was almost strong enough to vanquish the light of the Milky Way and the constellation of the White Tiger rising in the west. Beneath the tiger, the horizon lit up in strobing explosions as Germans and Britons traded Black Marias, whiz-bangs, and Jack Johnsons back and forth between them. Su looked up with a shock as a trio of French Sopwith camels buzzed overhead. The launching biplanes cast unearthly black silhouettes against the midnight blue sky and its veil of stars. Zi Chang came out of the tent and saw the planes sailing away. He watched the high explosive detonations lighting the horizon, jaw slack in awe. Did you ever see such a thing? He sat next to Su. Sounds like New Year's at the Gate of Peace in Beijing. Su let out a low whistle. I bet it feels like the whole city of Beijing is being dropped on your head from a mountaintop if you're sitting underneath it. Chang shuddered at the thought. Eesh, one building at a time. On the upside, we ain't gonna be the ones sleeping under it. Unless the Canadians lose their war. That possibility had not occurred to Chang. Hey, we'll see, said Su. Chang laughed. You're the Chinaman in the parable. Which one? Asked Su. The one where the farmer has a son. Whole village tells him how lucky he is to have a strong boy. Farmer says, we'll see. Boy grows up to be a strong young man. Marries up the prettiest girl in the village. Becomes the best horseman, too. Whole village is telling the farmer, look how strong and handsome your boy's become.
He's going to be a real someone in this world. Farmer just nods and says, "We'll see." Then one day, his son falls off a horse and goes lame in his leg. Can't sit a horse no more. Can't barely walk. Whole village tells the farmer how sad they are for his terrible misfortune. Farmer says, "We'll see." Then one day, soldiers come through conscripting for the war. They get to the farmer's house, see the crippled young man, and they don't take the boy because he doesn't walk good anymore. And they say, "No offense, but we're not going to take some crippled boy to war. Bad luck for your house's honor, eh?" Farmer shrugs and says, "We'll see." Days go by. The word comes back that all the young men that marched off for war, so excited and ready to bring honor to their mamas and papas, got killed straight away. Farmer goes and hugs his son, kisses him on the forehead. He may be crippled, but he's alive. Whole grieving village tells the farmer, "You the luckiest so-and-so in town. You still got a son." Farmer just smiles, shrugs, and says, "We'll see." You see? The crippling turns out to be the best thing that could have happened. Sue nodded. The farmer's a wise fellow. Chang smiled. Yes, you never know what event will be a blessing and what event will be a curse. Maybe the worst thing a man can do is decide for himself whether what happens to him is good or bad, né? Gotta take it all as it comes. Sergeant Lee came striding through the dark camp. He saw Sue and Chang watching the distant fireworks and paused. He looked at the horizon. A couple impressive flashes burst and echoed their way, the thunder rolling over them 10 seconds after the light. Li Peng grinned. "It's really something, eh?" Sue and Chang looked up and nodded. "Yes, Sergeant Lee." Sergeant Lee squatted next to them and took out a pack of cigarettes. He shook the cigarettes loose and offered them up to the boys. Sue and Chang nodded gratitude as they pulled cigarettes from the pack. "You're going to see it firsthand before you know it." Li Peng took his own cigarette out and let it dangle from his lip as he put the pack into his breast pocket and patted his trousers for matches. Zi Chang pulled a box of matches out of his tunic. "I have matches, Sergeant Lee." Chang slid out a matchstick and struck it, then brought the flame to Peng's cigarette. Sergeant Lee puffed it to life. Chang leaned over and lit Sue's, then he brought the licking flame to the tip of his own cigarette. Before he could light it, Peng blew out the match. Chang smiled and looked at him, quizzical. Li Peng spattered tobacco fiber onto the grass. "3 on a match is bad luck." "Huh? I never heard that before." "Bad luck comes in 4s, said Chang. Sergeant Lee's smile was grim. "In the motherland, for certain, number 4 is shit. But not in the world you're in now. 3 seconds on a match is about the time it takes for the German version of them aeroplanes to find you in the dark and drop hell on your head. Close to the front is about the time it takes for German sharpshooters to get you in the bead, make your head burst open like a cantaloupe dropped on the cobblestones." Sue noticed that Li Peng was carefully cupping his cigarette's orange ember in his hand. Peng took out his own matchbox, carefully covered a match while he struck it. He held the flame out to Chang, who leaned forward and sucked life into his cigarette. 1, 2, said Li Peng. Chang stared at Sergeant Lee over the lit match, eyes wide. Sue leaned forward and blew the match out. Peng laughed quietly. "You're a fast learner. What's your name?" "Shen Su, ancestor of the gods. Your mama had some big aspirations for you, eh?" Sue looked down and quietly blushed. His grand name had always been something of a sore spot.
You're a big boy, too. Got some strength in those arms, eh? What kind of work did you do at home? Asked Peng. Smith. You got some skill with tools? Su shrugged. Adequate. Well, Shen Su. I like a fast learner with a strong back and humble disposition, and adequate is better than most of them peasants you come here with. We're going to try you out to be a section leader in the morning. See how you do with mechanics. Might be better use of your back than digging graves and shitholes for the Canadians to aim their chubby white assholes into. How's that sound? Shinsu mulled it over. Does it pay better? Ha! And a practical man at that. If you make the grade, and I put a stripe on your arm, it will. We'll see how you do and go from there. Sue nodded. You know 5 more smart boys got some strength, know their way around a wrench? Peng asked. I can find them, Shensu replied. Good. After they blow the rouse, come morning, you get some breakfast in your belly and bring me 5 smart, strong lads. We got a mission to do. 4, said Zichang. Li Peng looked at him. You only got to find 4. I like tools, Sergeant Li. My father repaired farm equipment and carts all his life, Zichang said. Plus, you aspire to more than digging holes for loose stool and dead men, eh? Peng laughed. Yes, Sergeant Li, 100%, said Chang. I guess it's an auspicious night for me. He looked towards Sue. But still, bring me this skinny one and 5 more, with a little of your bulk, after breakfast. We're not in China, but 4 is still rotten fucking luck. With that, Sergeant Lee stood and headed off into the night, cigarette ember still cupped tightly in his palm. Sue and Chang copied him, carefully covering their own orange and black embers. How about that? Said Chang. An auspicious night for all 3 of us, ne? Sue nodded. We'll see. Chang laughed. Okay, wise farmer, we'll see. They watched the fireworks display on the horizon until Sergeant Lee's cigarettes were smoked to the last morsel. Then they ground them out, crawled back into the tent, and shut their eyes. Shensu came back to the now. Even with all the snowfall, he was sure he recognized the path before him. If he was not close to the dragon at this point, he thought he never would be. He lowered his head, ploughing on, wishing he could leave the past behind him, as his philosophy suggested he should, knowing that it no longer existed in a physical sense, but dully aware that it remained, its empty echo resounding, no matter what its physical limitations might be.